U.S. President Donald Trump delivers the State of the Union address for the first time to a divided Congress. Is female genital mutilation a cultural tradition, a dangerous ritual that should end, or both? And United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres discusses developments in Congo and Somalia. Africa 54 starts right now.
Good evening and welcome. I'm Vincent McCory. This is Africa 54. Tonight, we begin here in Washington, where in his second State of the Union address Tuesday night, U.S. President Donald Trump laid out an agenda that included calls of bipartisan cooperation and unity. But he also slammed what he called ridiculous partisan investigations and stood firm on his demand for a wall along America's southern border with Mexico. VOA White House correspondent Patsy Widakuswara reports from Capitol Hill.
President Trump broke with tradition and began his State of the Union speech without waiting to be introduced by the Democratic Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, with whom he clashed with in recent weeks.
We must reject the politics of revenge, resistance, and retribution.
As is the norm, Trump gave a long list of achievements.
There's nothing anywhere in the world that can compete with America.
But immigration soon came to the forefront, an issue Trump is fighting with Democrats who continue to deny his demand for $5.7 billion border wall funding.
In the past, most of the people in this room voted for a wall, but the proper wall never got built. I will get it built.
The wall feud partially closed the government for 35 days. If no deal is reached by February 15th, another government shutdown looms.
He didn't give the Democrats anything that they wanted to hear. He didn't make any offerings. He didn't propose any compromises. I don't think he moved anyone any closer towards a solution for keeping the government open.
Female lawmakers of the Democratic Party wore white to mark the suffragette movement that led to women's right to vote. Most of them did not clap during the speech, except when Trump extended an olive branch and noted that a century after suffragette, a record number of women are serving in Congress. On foreign policy, Trump expressed support for regime change in Venezuela and touted what he considered his successes, including the trade war with China, the U.S. withdrawal from a nuclear treaty with Russia, the reduction of tensions with North Korea, and the continuing pressure on Iran. Trump outlined elements of a bipartisan agenda, such as boosting infrastructure, giving paid family leave, lowering the cost of health care, eradicating HIV, the virus that causes AIDS, and childhood cancer. But he also pushed for issues important to his political base, including legislation prohibiting late-term abortions, and slammed the investigation into possible collusion between his presidential campaign and Russia during the 2016 election.
If there is going to be peace and legislation, there cannot be war and investigation.
Stacey Abrams, who narrowly lost a bid in November to be Georgia's governor, delivered the Democratic response highlighting access to voting rights.
We must reject the cynicism that says allowing every eligible vote to be cast and counted is a power grab.
From marriage equality, health care to confronting racism, Abrams laid out her party's agenda.
I think it sent a message that this is the Democratic Party of today. A woman of color, a woman who comes not from the politician class.
Another notable moment, possibly the first in a State of the Union address, lawmakers breaking out in song. For one of the president's guests, Pittsburgh Synagogue Massacre survivor Judah Samet on his 81st birthday. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News.
In the Democratic response to President Trump's State of the Union address, Stacey Abrams called for a renewed commitment to social and economic justice as a way to strengthen the country. Abrams, who narrowly lost the November election for governor of the southern state of Georgia, said that while she is very disappointed by the president's approach to the country's problems, she does not want him to fail.
But we need him to tell the truth and to respect his duties and respect the extraordinary diversity that defines America. Our progress has always been found in the refuge, in the basic instinct of the American experiment, to do right by our people.
Abrams criticized President Trump over the record-long partial government shutdown that ended in late January with an agreement for Democrats and Republicans to work for several weeks towards an agreement on border security measures. The closure kept 800,000 federal workers from getting paychecks for a month, while the dispute over Trump's desire for a border wall lingered with no resolution.
Making livelihoods of our federal workers a pawn for political games is a disgrace. The shutdown was a stunt engineered by the President of the United States, one that defied every tenet of fairness and abandoned not just our people, but our values.
Abrams also focused part of a address on voting rights, a key part of a gubernatorial campaign, saying the foundation of U.S. leadership worldwide is in free and fair elections where voters pick their leaders, not where politicians pick their voters. Last week, Democrats in the House of Representatives proposed a number of election reforms, including making Election Day a national holiday so more people could have the ability to get to polling sites. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell sharply rejected the package, saying the measures would benefit Democrats and amounted to a power grab. Abrams said voting rights is the next battle for our democracy and urged Americans to reject the cynicism that says allowing every eligible vote to be cast and counted is a power grab. For analysis of President Trump's State of the Union speech, I'm joined by VOA national correspondent Jim Malone. Jim, welcome back again.
Thanks, Vincent.
So what really stood out from this speech? What are some of the key issues?
Yeah, a couple of things jumped out at me. Number one, on one hand, you have the president, as presidents so often do in a State of the Union, extending the hand of bipartisanship, an offer to work with Democrats. But then just a few lines later, there's a warning that goes out to Democrats. If you investigate me, we're going to have war. So this is a classic, I think, Donald Trump thing. If you do it on my terms, we'll get along fine. If you come after me, I'll come after you harder. So that was one thing. His focus on this border wall was very apparent in the speech. He spent a long time on immigration, I think 15 minutes or so. So that was a major part of this address and remains a major focus for him because of his re-election hopes in 2020. And lastly, I think it's not what was said, it's what the images were we saw of the Democratic women in white. They represent kind of an actual point of resistance for the president now. This is how the political landscape in Washington has changed. Democrats control half the Congress, and they are flexing their muscles.
Now, someone might say some of the issues that he brought out, he has articulated them at different times, repeatedly. How significant is it that it comes out during a State of the Union address?
Well, for example, some of the things he talked about, there would be areas for cooperation, whether it's infrastructure spending, health care, fighting the opioids epidemic. There are areas here. I think the problem for Democrats is you have someone who comes to them once a year offering the olive branch, but then goes back onto Twitter for so many other days of the year attacking his opponents. So they see it as divisive. Republicans would argue Democrats unfairly cast him as kind of an evil figure, and all of their opposition to working together is simply based on the fact they don't like President Trump. So there's a real divide on that issue.
How significant was the response by the Democrats?
Well, first of all, you'd have to say that, you know, Stacey Abrams could be seen as a rising star in the Democratic Party, even though she lost her election last year. She does represent sort of where the Democratic Party is headed. Very much activated women voters, minority voters. So that has really kind of blossomed since President Trump came into office. So going forward, more and more, you're going to see someone like Stacey Abrams as the face of the party.
indeed. And one of the analysts said it kind of tells a lot about the Democratic Party. Jim, I want to thank you very much. Sure. Excellent insights as always.
Thank you.
Yes. Well, that's our thanks to national correspondent Jim Malone and all the wonderful analysis it gives us. Now, bipartisan U.S.-based watchdog says President Trump is attacking essential American institutions and democratic norms, including a free press, an independent judiciary, safeguards against corruption, and the legitimacy of elections. Freedom House says the U.S. democracy is robust, but now faces a threat to its very survival. VOA's diplomatic correspondent Cindy Sain has more from Washington.
In its annual report, the renowned watchdog Freedom House is warning that democracy is on the retreat worldwide and singles out the United States as a major concern. The current freedom rating puts American democracy on a level with Greece, Croatia, and Mongolia, but well below other democracies such as Germany, France, and Britain. Sarah Rapucci of Freedom House says core institutions are under assault.
And our biggest concerns are attacks on the rule on the judiciary, demonization of the press, corruption and conflicts of interest, and also attacks on the legitimacy of our election.
The White House declined to comment for this story. The president has repeatedly accused the news media of unfair coverage and has personally, verbally attacked individual reporters.
I'll tell you what, CNN should be ashamed of itself having you working for them. You are a rude, terrible person. You shouldn't be working for CNN.
Other experts say the U.S. is uniquely vulnerable because many of its democratic traditions are based on norms and not laws.
We are highly unusual among other countries. You know, many countries lost their democracies during World War II and rebuilt them with very strong modern constitutions that outlaw executive interference, that outlaw various things that don't even show up in our Constitution at all. So we depend a great deal on norms. Those norms have been under pressure for years.
The U.S. has traditionally been a role model for other countries and still has great impact on others, Rapucci says.
Other countries do watch what's happening in the United States and take cues from our leaders' behavior. I think the president's frequent praise for some of the world's worst dictators gives the impression that he doesn't believe in the importance of democracy.
Both Rapucci and Kleinfeld believe U.S. democratic institutions are strong and resilient, but call on members of Congress and ordinary citizens to stand up for them and not take for granted they will always be there. Cindy Sain, VOA News, Washington.
February 6th has been designated as United Nations Day for Zero Tolerance for Female Genital Mutilation, or FGM. The practice is widespread in parts of Africa, but it also happens here in the United States. FGM has sparked a global clash between those who define it as a cultural tradition and those who say it's a dangerous ritual that should end. Africa 54's Haiti Adams Fitzpatrick has this story.
34 years ago in Sierra Leone, an 11-year-old girl was told by her stepmother to dress up for a special occasion. F.A. Cole had no idea someone would be putting a razor blade to her genitals. She demonstrates how she was led to a forest, bound and blindfolded.
So they laid me down on the ground, what I call the bed of death, and 2 or 4 of the women held me down. They spread my legs open and pinned me down. And then the woman who was the cutter, she's always the head of them all, she sat on my chest. And so she started to cut my clitoris. I began to fight and scream and wriggle under her, just looking for somebody to help me, somebody to come to my rescue.
Cole recalls days of excruciating pain, followed by years of wondering why.
When I came to America and I started doing research and started talking about my story, that's when I realized the damage, not just the sexual damage, but the psychological damage that was done.
The World Health Organization identifies 3 types of FGM. In type 1, the clitoris is partially or totally removed. Type 2 goes further, including the labia. And type 3 involves removing the labia and stitching it to narrow the vaginal opening. Cole now lives in Washington and campaigns to end FGM in the United States and Africa. But not everyone agrees. Also in Washington is anthropologist Flombai Amadou. She too is from Sierra Leone and says she was circumcised, not mutilated.
Absolutely excruciating.
Amadou says it's a rite of passage into womanhood in Korno culture. She believes anti-FGM campaigners are putting African cultures under siege.
Again, the grand narrative of mutilation is completely, inappropriate, because most women do not identify with this terminology. They don't understand how their cultures are being represented, and women's sexuality is being represented in the media, because that's not how it's lived on the ground. So it's really important that FGM campaigners understand that the messages that they're sounding out to women they're not working, they're not effective. What they're doing is driving the practice underground.
A cultural practice with often serious medical consequences. It has physicians at major U.S. medical centers and teaching hospitals concerned about whether American doctors are equipped medically and culturally to treat women who have been circumcised.
It was my second month of my residency, and I was on my OB rotation, and there was a woman from Djibouti in East Africa who was coming in labor. Get ready to do the pelvic examination, put my gloves on, and suddenly I realized that I can't put my fingers in there because the whole area is closed off. I had no idea.
That experience inspired Dr. Ranit Mashori to teach other doctors about FGM, especially as they treat more immigrants from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. She stresses communication and cultural humility.
Medical education here, to most physicians that I know, or most clinicians, this is a shocking situation. We can't forget that some women are very proud because that ensures their marriageability and economic prospects. So a lot of women want that to happen. So many of us can't understand that. The communication tools to ask about it in a non-judgmental way. Those are, to me, more important than how to deal with the medical complications, even though they're there. In some women, the cutting has healed, there are no scars, maybe there are no long-term effects, but the long-term effects are here and here.
FGM is now illegal in 22 African countries. In the U.S., a federal ban was overturned recently in court, but it is still prohibited by state laws in nearly 50% of the country. Heidi Adams-Fitzpatrick, VOA News, Washington.
Well, we want to know what you think about Africa 54 and the stories we covered. Join the conversation on Facebook. The address is Africa 54. You're also streaming our show live on Facebook. So check us out and share our show with your friends. Find me on Twitter at VOA Vince McCory. Still ahead on Africa 54, boosting cooperation between the United Nations and African Union. But first, a look at Wednesday's headlines.
In Nigeria, citizens displaced as a result of attacks by Boko Haram protest in the streets of Maiduguri to raise awareness for their difficult situation and perceived government inaction. In Burkina Faso, regional leaders met Tuesday in Ouagadougou for a one-day meeting aimed at beefing up coordination against Islamic militants that have stepped up attacks in Africa's Sahel region. In Ethiopia, hundreds of migrants stranded in Yemen due to ongoing conflict there returned home thanks to a voluntary program run by the International Organization for Migration. Finally, in Egypt, the Confederation of African Football inspected stadiums and facilities across the country and says it's confident that the host nation will be ready to stage this year's Africa's Cup of Nations.
United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres travels to Ethiopia this week for the African Union Summit. He told VOA UN correspondent Margaret Bashir that cooperation between the UN and the African Union has improved substantially. In the first part of their conversation, Margaret asked him about developments in Congo and in Somalia.
So, full agenda there. Let's start. DRC just had elections, just had inauguration, but a disputed election outcome. But some countries seem satisfied that there was just basically a peaceful transfer of power. Are you concerned at all that there may yet be trouble ahead in Congo?
Congo is a very complex country. There are many factors of concern. The eastern part of Congo, as you know, still has a large number of armed groups, and we have Ebola at the same time. But we consider that what's important now, after the elections with the new government, is to create the conditions for inclusive dialogue among all parties and to make sure that we have a transition of power that allows for the country to move ahead, and we'll be supporting the country to move ahead.
On January 1st, the Somali government asked your special representative to leave, Mr. Haysom. You haven't named a new envoy yet. Do you have anything to say about a new envoy yet? And if not, what's the delay? And where are relations between the UN and Mogadishu right now?
I've just sent the Secretary General of Political Affairs. She was a few days in Mogadishu. There was a very constructive dialogue between the government of Somalia and the UN. And I'll be appointing now very soon a new envoy. And I hope that there will be a new beginning of our relations that is very important. We need to have Somalia being able to overcome its problems, its difficulties. There was a lot of progress done, namely in economic reform. The economic situation has substantially improved. We hope that this will allow for the debt problems to be solved, and we have encouraged the IMF and World Bank to work for that purpose, and we welcome the very important developments that occurred in this regard. And we want to support the African Union mission in order to be able to contain the problem of Al-Shabaab. And we will be fully supportive of the government for the reforms that are necessary for the country to move forward in a positive way.
This weekend's summit, one of the main themes of it is about forced displacement. Many African migrants trying to cross the Mediterranean, many of them dying. Then you have refugees, you have internally displaced. What is the main thing that the United Nations can do to address this? And what concrete solutions are you bringing with you to the summit?
I would like to see in other parts of the world, especially in richer parts of the world, the same generosity that I've always seen in Africa, and especially during the time I worked as High Commissioner for Refugees. But I can tell you that the International Organization of Migration, the High Commission on Refugees, and the different UN agencies will be fully supportive of all African efforts in order to, first of all, protect and support those forced to move, and second, to allow for solutions for them. And the best solution is always, as you know, for refugees to be able to go back home in safety and dignity. But we will be supporting African states and the African Union in all these dimensions, and very interested in making sure that the world recognizes the enormous effort Africans are making in this regard and expresses to the Africans the same solidarity that Africans have been able to show.
Well, that was United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres speaking with VOA UN correspondent Margaret Bashir ahead of leaving for the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa. Join us tomorrow for part 2 of their conversation about prospect for peace in South Sudan and China's role in Africa. Pope Francis has admitted that Catholic priests have abused nuns, in some cases keeping them as sex slaves. Speaking to reporters Tuesday after a historic visit to the United Arab Emirates, the pontiff said the church has worked to address the problem, but said it was still going on. The Pope also said more needs to be done to protect women everywhere. Here's VOA's Zlatin Zahok.
The Pope was asked about sexual abuse of nuns on his return flight from Abu Dhabi. He acknowledged that it has happened.
It's not something that everyone does, but there have been priests and even bishops who have done this. And I think it is still taking place, because it is not as though the moment you become aware of something, it goes away.
The Vatican's women's magazine, Women Church World, reported a few days ago that in some cases, nuns were forced to have abortions, which is against the Church's teachings. Last November, the Catholic Church's Global Organization for Nuns denounced the culture of silence and secrecy that prevented them from speaking out. The global Me Too movement was credited with encouraging nuns to speak out. The Pope admitted that some nuns have been used as sex slaves by the clergy. He commended his predecessor, Pope Benedict, for his effort to prevent the abuse.
We have suspended a few clerics and sent some away over this. And also, I don't know whether the process is over, but we have also dissolved a few female religious orders in connection with this, which is corruption, no?
Pope Francis said the mistreatment of women is a worldwide problem, in some regions more than in others.
I dare say that humanity has not yet matured. Women are second-class citizens, and it starts from there, no? It is a cultural problem.
The pontiff praised a small girl who broke through security in Abu Dhabi to hand-deliver a letter to him.
That girl has a future. Dare I say, her poor husband, eh? She was courageous. I liked it. It took courage to do that.
Pope Francis made a historic visit to the United Arab Emirates to promote peace in the Middle East. He said there is no religious justification for raising a hand in violence against a fellow human being. Zlatica Hoke, VOA News, Washington.
Here's what's trending. Now, artist and sculptor Lungelo Gumede wants to carve out a unique spot on the global map for Durban. In 2004, Gumede had the chance to visit Madame Tussauds in New York after an exhibition in which one of his paintings was featured. He returned to Durban, determined to create Africa's version of the famous wax museum. He's regularly commissioned by the government, private organizations and individuals to create pieces, but the statues of icons like Nelson Mandela, Huma Sakela and Michael Jackson are privately funded and are being kept to eventually be exhibited in his museum. And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com for more news. Tune in to VOA's evening radio show Africa News Tonight at 1800 UTC, and in the mornings, Daybreak Africa between 0300 and 0600 UTC, Monday through Friday. Thanks for watching and have a good night from all of us in Washington.